So, folks who do not know, we have Max Ajl here to talk with us. Max is a scholar um, in Tunisia, excuse me, and he is also an anti-imperialist. And I really wanted to get Max to come on here because I have my own thoughts on what's occurring in Syria, but I do think it's important to kind of get some context in what's happening because it's so much happening and so many opinions around what's happening. And I know that you are well versed on the area, so I wanted to bring you on. So, how are you, Max?
I'm all right. I'm all right. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so I'll start. I know you recently did an interview with the Solidarity Network of the Black Alliance of Peace, which I did not know before I asked you to come here. So I think that that's good. So if folks have not seen that, that's available on the that website, and there he also gives some context to what we're seeing. But I did want to ask a few questions, and then also allow my co-host to ask some. Um, but with the fall of Assad and then Shiraz's rise, Syria has shifted from an acts as a resistance stronghold to a battleground for competing regional projects and interests. So I'm wondering how significant is this shift and what you think it suggests, particularly concerning Turkey's development role and then the conversation around Israel's peace line.
I think it's a strategic loss for the forces of liberation in the world. Very simply, right? Syria was a geopolitical or geographic space that the Israelis could not go into, the Americans could not go into, except for the Northeast and the Northwest. They did not control the airspace. It was a transshipment line. It was a place where people could have, from the Palestinian factions, could have political meetings. There were underground weapons factories supplying munitions to the forces in direct confrontation with Israel. All of that is now finished, right? For a period at least. Although there's probably been some reconstitution of supply lines because the central state is not all that strong in Syria, at least not strong enough to fully control supply lines. So, but the strategic loss is very real. There were reports that they were using the airspace for the refueling of Israeli fighter jets on the way to attack Iran. And they also, of course, they're in a position to encircle Hezbollah and so forth. So this has been a serious blow, and I don't think it makes sense to downplay it. Right? I don't think it's a fatal blow to anything at all. But the situation is disastrous. It's also it's of course disastrous for Syrians, and it's also of course opens the door for an acceleration of Turkey's regional project. Right? I mean, Turkey is somewhat quietly developed into industrial powerhouse, right? It's a very large economy. It's one of the 20th largest economies in the world. There's been a massive wage suppression in Turkey and also a massive, with huge ecological effects, which is very much related to the Kurdish struggle. Um, and the result is that Turkey has a massive manufacturing base. And when you have a massive manufacturing base, especially if you're not doing it on the basis of building up your internal market, although there is some of that, you need to export. And so they want to connect to the Gulf market. This is part of how they see it. This is part of how their ambitions express themselves. Because the Syrian market is very small. Right? Syria is devastated. People are hungry there and exhausted. The economy was completely shattered by the U.S. war and the U.S. sanctions. So Syria is not a market really for Turkey, but what is a market is the industrially basically underdeveloped Gulf states where you have a market of well over $1 trillion GDP market for potential Turkish manufactured goods, and they can use Syria as a transshipment point to move that stuff. And so this is kind of how they once now that they've shattered the Syrian government in compliance and in coordination with the US, Israel, the Gulf states. Now each side is kind of seeing, okay, which advantage do I want to press for myself in this shattered Turkey, and under what format should it be reconstituted as a geopolitical corridor, as a trading corridor? Should it just be fragmented? And so forth. So various forces are now at the table debating with weapons, of course, with both words and weapons over what Syria if, will be in the future.
So, Max, can you put into context these latest events that have happened in Syria with Israel outright bombing Damascus? It was reported, and again, my reference is all Western media, so I assume it's bullshit, right? But they said that the defense ministry in Damascus was attacked, and that these so-called sectarian, or skirmishes between the Bedouins and the Druze near Golan Heights, in that area that Israel obviously is trying to capture to make greater Israel. I'm not sure, but what is the latest, or what is the context of these latest aggressions and bombings by Israel? Because Israel doesn't seem to get tired of bombing its neighbors, and I was just curious because I thought that from the West perspective, victory had been achieved in Syria. Bashar al-Assad had been deposed and run out of the country, and now I just imagine that Israel, the United States, whoever was going to come in and set up shop in Syria the way they've done in Iraq. But what is the meaning of these latest airstrikes in Syria?
Well, we're still in a speculative stage because we haven't seen the long-term game unfurl yet, right? And there's some competing interests. But what it looks like is that it is an early attempt at, in the medium term, balkanization of the country, right? Fragmentation of the country, which has long been basically the ambition, right? To de facto, Iraq is partially fragmented for that matter, right? They didn't reset it up with unitary state like it was under Saddam, right? From the Kurds have their own powerful kind of partially autonomous ability to wield power in Iraq. Syria has long been de facto partitioned, right? I mean, since 2011, Syria has also been under a de facto partition, right? The northeast was the US and the so called SDF, right? The Kurdish forces mixed with also Arab forces mixed with mercenaries. The Northwest was carved out as a Turkish but also US protectorate with all of the civilian infrastructure, low key being actually supplied through US nonprofits, right? The entire medical infrastructure and so forth, supplied directly by U.S. approved nonprofits. So the partition was already de facto, and so now it's I think Israel and the U.S. would like to see accelerated de facto partition, and this is not something that the Syrian government is fully opposed to either. I mean, so they've been accepting talks of a kind of form of federalism, a form of basically de facto partition in which this guy Jolani can claim to be the ruler of Syria, and meanwhile, there is a very massive Israeli buffer zone which is demilitarized, and how much is Israel sending in its own people to both bomb the central government and also supply the Druze with weapons is a bit unclear. It's opaque at this moment, to be honest. But Israel is, of course, bombing the central government because it wants to say to the central government, okay, this is going to be our expanded security zone, which is an extension of the operations they already did. Right. In fact, the first thing they did was they took out the first thing the Israeli government, with the backing of the US, did when the Syrian government fell was take out all the heavy military installations, the heavy military industrial infrastructure that was the property of the Syrian people, right? That was wiped out so that, in essence, the Syrian government if it ever was reconstituted as a sovereign government, would not be able to project power. And also, so that this new rump Syrian government will only be able to exercise very limited power. So the bombing was real. The bombing definitely happened. I mean, it was, there was footage of the Syrian newscaster who was shocked as the bomb went off behind her. This was not, it was not a psyop in the sense that it didn't happen, right? Now, it was not, but it was not another attempt at regime change. It was kind of shot across the bow to the Syrian government to remind it that this is what the Israeli agenda is. This is what the U.S. agenda is. And I see them as co-terminus, by the way. I see no distinction between the Israeli and U.S. agenda. And I can talk about that a little more, but I see no difference whatsoever. And what they want is a partitioned and weak Syria that's unable, or that would require a kind of social and cultural revolution in order to, again, have the capacity to offer any challenge to U.S. and Israeli power in the region.
Now, when the Israelis said that they were bombing Damascus to protect the Druze, that's what I meant by the bullshit. I'm like, oh, really? You're here to, oh, we got to protect our minority. Oh, y'all worried about minorities. Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah, but, this is, it's like, this is like when they give a little food after starving someone, right? There's the literal truth. They're like, yes, in this microsecond, we have a sequence of action that could be understood as protecting a minority, but also we have created the situation in which there are these pogroms against the Jews in the first place, right? By these militias that are either not under the control or are partially under the control of the central state. And we knew that this would be the predictable effect of collapsing the actual central state under Bashar, right? So, yeah, this is the humanitarian action of Israel and the U.S.
Even to give a bit more context to what Kim was asking, like Jelani's consolidation of power, that involved like the massacres against the Alawite communities before this. So I wanted to know, like, what is the context of this sort of sectarian violence? And then also, um, there are conversations, and in the interview that you had with BAF Solidarity Network, you mentioned that the disconnect exists in all societies, right? But why was Syria's internal dissent so easily weaponized, especially since there was little to anything said about the massacres of the Alawite community?
Right. So, the Syrian, the U.S. has been, there's always some level of, or there has been for a long time, sectarian identification in the Arab region, right? And of course, it took on a modern form, we can say, with the end of the Ottomans, and then the difficulty and how it was weaponized under the colonial administrations. So sectarianism in some form is present, but it's not like in people's DNA, of course, right? It's a social relationship that allows people to interpret state formation, who has power, who doesn't have power. But it's also, of course, encouraged as a way of looking at the relationship of power and powerlessness in a given situation, right? And so this has taken on a particular, so there's been a long-term presence of anti-Alawi sectarianism that's been promoted by the kind of a dispossessed agrarian bourgeoisie in Syria, going back to the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, right? Including massacres targeting Alawis in the early 1980s, right? And it was able to do this because they propagandized the idea that the Bashar government, which was actually, originally these were governments of, going back to the 1960s, these were governments that came from dispossessed rural minorities. But later on, the power structure shifted, but they were able to present the idea that these governments were Alawi governments, right? Now, this was not true, although it had a grain of truth like all propaganda, but it was presented as such, especially by the Gulf states, who aggressively grafted their own propaganda on these already existing sectarian divisions in Syria. And this really accelerated in 2006, right? when the Gulf states realized that if you wanted to split apart a potential basis of Arab unity based on confronting Israel, you would need to play the sectarian card. So a lot of money went into the region, not to invent sectarianism out of nowhere, but to magnify it into a far larger structural problem than it had been before, so that people understood their poverty, which was real in Syria, as produced by a specific regime of sectarian rule, right? This is the problem. And so the opposition, the political discontent, was already became deeply sectarian starting in 2011 during what people choose to call a revolution, right? They identified their enemy as belonging to a specific sect. And this actually meant that in a multi-confessional society, which was Syria, right, this would immediately mean that the so-called revolution would immediately assume a reactionary form. The more and more people identified as sectarian, and the more and more foreign fighters came in who also were sectarian, right? You had hundreds of thousands of deeply sectarian foreign fighters who went in thinking, who are paid, of course, and equipped, and are going in with the mindset that they are fighting against an Alawi regime, right? So this is how it was weaponized. Now, I think this question of, it's on the one hand, Syria was a poor and weak country, right? And you had literally hundreds of thousands of mercenaries pouring in. You had a war that cost probably hundreds of billions of dollars, right? In black, bags of like unmarked, like black bags of cash, right? That no one knows where they came from or what was in them, other than the black ops that are engineering the transshipment of these bags of cash. You had a massive war from 2011 to 2024 that Syria lasted, right? So the weaponization of discontent did not collapse the country until 2024. It took 13 years of proxy war in a neoliberal context, right? In a country surrounded by enemies to collapse the country, right? With fronts opening up from Turkey, with people pouring in and fighters pouring in from Iraq, with fighters and US military and spy installations in Jordan, with foreign fighters pouring over the border from northern Lebanon. And it took, right, 13 years to collapse the country. So, in fact, on the one hand, you have what I'm talking about is, first, there are certain conditions that allow for the weaponization of sectarianism and the way that social fractures are used to burn down the country. On the other hand, it's notable that it took a massive effort for this to happen. It did not happen instantly, right? And so you had patriotic Sunni in Syria, many of them, right? Or you had a lot who were actually patriotic. And then you had people who said, okay, I'm neither comfortable with the ruling government, nor am I comfortable with this ruling, with the nature of the sectarian opposition. I would like to live my life in a more or less non-sectarian manner. You had all of this going on at the same time, right? But the problem is the people with the guns were sectarian, right? And it is now the rule of the gun. And this is kind of what has delivered Syria into the state it's in today.
Um, okay. Thank you for that. Come on, I didn't know if you wanted to ask something before I ask another question.
Yeah, I'm curious about your feelings on whether or not you mentioned that the supply lines earlier on some of supply lines could still be established because the country was somewhat fractured. Is there an avenue for the resistance to control or to support indigenous forces in Syria at this stage to carve out some area where resistance still flows, liberated territory? I know the axis of resistance obviously has been weakened tremendously over the last few months or last year and a half. But obviously, it's not defeated. So, what is your prognosis for some ways in which Syria, even as it's fallen somewhat into Western hands, still provides some pathway for resistance?
I think we will see in the future. There will be attempts, surely, to reconstitute armed groups that resist the central state. Right? I mean, this is the strategy of Iran is to support in various states asymmetric forces that it can have a convergence of interests with. That's a mouthful. I didn't say proxy because of the way people are using proxy in our current discourse, right? Where there are these proxies who have no independent interest, as though regular Syrians have plenty of interest in resisting the sectarian thug regime that's sowing chaos in their country, right? So that's why I don't say proxy. But of course, there will be those attempts, but um, that remains to be seen, right? And it'll be a long term process. And the fall was now 7.5 months ago, right? So it's going to be a long term process. It seems to me that the reconstitution of supply lines to Hezbollah are much more likely by sea. Rather, um, there will be a sea route, uh, maybe through the Sinai, maybe through Libya, then over the sea, and then to Hezbollah that way. It seems it's a very, although the situation, the whole Syrian geographical and geopolitical field is very porous because of it's such a weak state that hasn't really. It's only partially reestablished authority in various places. But it's going to be some time before we see um, effective resistance to the the current regime, the current project in Syria. Unfortunately,
Um, so this is probably my last question. Something that you mentioned about it taking 13 years. Um, I'm interested in that for my own reasons because I recall when it first erupted, at least on social media, it was a different format of the way folks engage social media then, right? So the conversations or the diatribes or the insults of being called an Assadist could have been easily combated in real time, and then we fast forward to 2024 and everyone is on a particularly different medium, right? Nobody's really on Twitter in that same way. They're getting their information out on TikTok, which it confines or limits the way that people can actually in real time combat the things that are being said. So we see an overwhelming use of TikTok as it results to Syria, as things were developing. So Western narratives primarily were framing the conflict as a liberation struggle, and anyone who attempted to interject, was getting called an Assadist, etc., because they were not looking at the overwhelming evidence of this being a foreign-backed kind of attempt for regime change. Um, what would you contribute to the persistent refusal? Because even now in the chat, there's some instances of that, but the persistent refusal to acknowledge Western imperialism's role and how this has taken shape, and also the role of the quote unquote Western left, and how this has escalated. Um,
Mm.
Something that took 13 years.
Okay. So I think there's two things that really have to be kept in mind, right? And I see the persistence of Syria being a controversial matter, in part, but only in part, related to the fact that people don't agree, especially on what happened in Syria from March to July 2011. That's the critical point, right? That's really the critical point. And it's not that people don't agree in like their general interpretation of it. people are dealing with two totally different sets of facts, right? You have one person over there being like, the sky is blue, and the other person is like, are you blind? The sky is red. Like, there's just like, they're in different political universes of understanding reality, right? And this is a huge problem, right? In that, um, in that, I think honestly that our side, and here I don't want to speak about the errors of the real propagandists for the other side or whatever, because that's a class antagonist, right? That's not someone who can be engaged with. That's someone to be combated, right? But I think we need to understand why this is still such a explosively controversial issue, right? And say, okay, we aren't why aren't we agreeing? Okay, well, there is a narrative, right, that says that there was a peaceful uprising that only reluctantly and internally militarized in the face of repression in July 2011, and then all the foreign stuff started to pour in, right? But this was a peaceful and democratic uprising, and that's a nice truth, but there are facts that it doesn't sit with, right? There are basic empirical facts that are very well documented or that are sketchily documented but should have been investigated properly, that don't fit with that narrative, and that if you accept them, then that other narrative collapses, right? The other narrative is there was discontent with the Syrian government. People did not like what their lives were like. They didn't like how they were being ruled, which is normal, in fact, in most political situations, right? And I think it's okay to accept that. But what I think is that shouldn't be allowed then to pretend that the U.S. was not trying to overthrow the Syrian government, starting at least in 2006, and that in 2011, starting in February and March, there were unidentified armed groups carrying out attacks against the Syrian security forces, both police and also military. Um, so, first of all, by definition, that is no longer a peaceful protest. That is an armed insurrection, right? But second of all, um, when I see an armed insurrection suddenly in a U.S. target, I'm like, why is this happening? Who's running it, right? Who's running this realm of operations? And we see, for example, that in Jisr al-Shahur, which was there was a large massacre of Syrian security forces. And I think a lot of people in the West have unfortunately become accustomed to the idea to identify the state and security forces with pure coercion, right? Which I don't agree with, right? I don't agree with that. I'm in favor of the community control, the popular control over the apparatus of conversion. Like, I'm an old school Leninist in this respect. Like, you take the state, it you don't wish it away. You take it and make it serve popular forces. Now, this is in the North. But in the South, you have a whole different thing where a state has legitimate self-defense needs. It doesn't mean we think it's correct that the state should be carrying out repressive violence against civilians. I don't. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we support like wanton violence no matter who is carrying out against state security forces, right? And I think this is something that people are reluctant to think about, accept, or articulate, and to understand this was actually systematic, right? I was talking to an Alawi researcher here in Tunis who was visiting. He said Jisr al-Shahur was the most well-known incident of a massacre. He said there were dozens of many Jisr al-Shahurs. That is, dozens of these operations which contributed to a situation of military conflict where the uprising became deeply militarized, right? And that became the dominant expression of political antagonism. right? And you can see this, for example, if you go and trace the casualty counts put out the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. You go, you can, they're harder and harder to find on the website. You can look at them and you see a very large number of security forces as numbers of the, as a percentage of the dead, a noticeable number that are out of any proportion to the capacity, the violence capacity of an unarmed group that are like throwing rocks or something at military forces. No, it's clear that there was an attempt to militarize the conflict and turn it into this zero sum game where one side of the so-called game is backed by imperialism and is turning it, using the militarism as an excuse to infiltrate its forces, take over the political direction of the insurrection, and burn down the country. And so the other aspect that is very central here is that the protests themselves were being militarized by black operations, right? By Qatari and U.S. black ops that no one wants to discuss because we don't have proof of them. Because they're black operations, these are psyops in their very nature. We don't have adequate documentation of them until it's politically irrelevant, right? And so much of the North American left is like, okay, well, if that doesn't have 14 footnotes and that hasn't appeared in a peer-reviewed journal, I'm not going to take that seriously because that is a conspiracy theory. I'm sorry, but capitalism and imperialism are systems that are logical conspiracies. That is, the ruling class and its political bureaus are by definition conspiratorial. They conspire together in their interests, right? And those interests play out in something we call history, which is a bunch of actors, not all of which is visible immediately in the empirical record, right? So this is to go back to it. There were reports. The only place you can find a report of this, I believe, in a mainstream news outlet was in an Israeli paper, like Times of Israel or something, which reported that there were snipers fired into demonstrations in, I believe, March or April, that there were snipers firing into demonstrations, right? And then this was dismissed, and it was said that it was the Syrian government firing snipers into demonstrations. No, there were snipers both within the crowds and outside the crowds. And then once that's done, of course, the demonstrations themselves are going to rapidly militarize, and rapidly it will become a common sense to identify the state as something that has to be removed rather than something to be negotiated with if it's engaging in wanton violence against its population, right? So it's understandable how a portion of this Syrian democracy or protest movement came to understand the world as it was, especially when it denied the external role. But then it became very self-interested in suggesting that actually the violence was purely coming from the Syrian state, and that this in turn puts all the responsibility of the Syrian state for what happened, when in fact the Syrian state was a target of imperialism. So this is a long explanation because I think you actually asked me one of the trickier questions that I find to talk about, and it just takes a bit of time because I want to be clear about what I'm stating, and I think it's okay on our side to say yes, like there was a state. I mean, Ali Qadri, who is the most important Arab Marxist theorist that we should be reading, was very clear about this in his essay, The Political Economy of the Syrian Crisis, that there was capitalist extraction and non-democratic forms of rule in Syria and so forth, but that Syria was actually being attacked for being a logistical and military backbone for the resistance. Everyone's like, we can hold two truths at once. Like the Syria is bad and Syria is bad. I'm like, no. How about you hold two truths at once? That like the world is a complicated place, but we don't accept the U.S. imposing its violence on the world, imposing its wish of how the world should be by force on the periphery, right? So I think we need to do better in understanding this specific set of events, and then we can explain it better to people who may be legitimately confused by the amount of propaganda that's been spread in front of their eyes, and then they can better understand how to orient to the events subsequent to it and the narratives that purport to explain the subsequent events. I don't know. I hope that was clear. I don't know.
No, I deeply appreciate that you did take your time to respond, primarily because I have not said much about Syria because I do think it is important how we respond to what we're seeing. So watching how it has developed into what it is today, I think really requires a particular kind of context and nuance. And historical memory that people seem to not really engage. So I do appreciate you taking time to respond to that thoroughly.
Yeah, sure.
I do
Okay.
have one.
Oh,
Oh, I
sorry.
know we're supposed to.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
see we're
I'm
quick.
done.
I do have one quick question, maybe, because I'm interested. It's more general, not to Syria, but I'm interested in what you feel is Russia's role, particularly now with the resistance. Because individually, I feel like obviously Russia did a lot to preserve Assad during a particular time period. But then it also felt like Russia also allowed or did not stop Israeli continual bombardment of positions that were strategic for the resistance. And then, as we've seen during this timeline, obviously Russia is bogged down in a war of Western making, but still, it feels like Russia in terms of its own, maybe its own interests, has not thrown in deeply, as deeply, let's say, as the resistance has, or Iran in particular has thrown in with Russia in terms of supplying it with drones and ballistic missiles and so forth. Russia, it feels like, has not returned the favor in some ways. So I'm interested in what your take is on the role of Russia within the resistance and or supporting the resistance and or its, again, as I would characterize it, it's lukewarm support for the resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think at base there is probably not a strong enough sense within the Russian government that the U.S. is an existential enemy of humanity, right? Um, and we see those contradictions to be sure everywhere. But I think in a lot of governments that, in fact, are fighting the U.S. Right, as we know, like Russia is at war with the U.S. in the Ukraine, right? And it knows that it's at war with the U.S., but it seems to me that Putin still believes he can arrive at a kind of modus vivendi somehow with the U.S. Um, Now, the in Syria, I think for clear reasons, we don't have a clear account of what happened. But it seems to me that the Russians have maintained their naval capacity, right, their naval bases in Western Syria, and so there was an arrangement made, right, which it's important to be clear on. Like there was an arrangement made with that probably people internal to the Syrian government before the its fall, because there's a lot of old Syrian government high levels who have been reconstituted into the new Syrian government. But there was basically an arrangement made that the Russians would be allowed to retain this strategic foothold, right? So they're looking out for their interests as they understand them, which is like, in fact, what everybody does. But the problem is, so then the problem becomes, how is Russia understanding its interests? And where does that conflict with the interests of the global working class, the global working people, right? And in this case, the fall of Syria was a disaster. I mean, it's a disaster for the people of Palestine, right? These famine operations, which are starvation operations, would not have been possible, I think, if Syria was still with all the with all the problems of Syria and its support for the resistance in the last 2 years. I don't think these starvation operations would be occurring if Syria had not fallen. But for Russia, I mean, I think Russia is in an objectively is forced into, in fact, very firm anti-imperialist actions vis-a-vis its war with the US in the Ukraine, but also its very extensive uh, military exchange and technology exchange with Iran, right? That portions of the Iranian industrial plan and also Iranian circumvention of the sanctions regime is because of Russia, which retains a very sophisticated technological base, right? And this is actually discussed in the defense. The defense commentary, like the defense think tanks and so forth, they're very open about this. That Russia is also what's enabling some of the Iranian industrial resilience, which is the backbone of the resistance overall, the axis of resistance, which is still, people think it's over. It's not. It's not over. It's just weakened, and it lost a portion of it, but it's still very real. And so the Russians are also there, and the Russians are also moving to all sorts of, the Russians have also been the basis of a shift in the Egyptian government away from U.S. weaponry, is now using primarily Russian and secondarily Chinese weaponry, right? The entire defense systems, not the entire, I think between 60 and 80% of the defense systems have been reoriented, notably, right? And China is agreeing on bilateral trade in their own currencies with the Egyptians. So there's a lot going on, and I don't mean to call like Egypt part of the axis of resistance. They're actually the axis of starvation right now. But what I just mean is that there are also these structural shifts that are ongoing, and they reflect the interests of these governments as they see their own interests. So Russia is um, not the ally we would like to see to Iran or Yemen or Syria, certainly not Palestine, right? It has huge trading relationships with Israel, and it has over 1 million, I think, dual citizens, right? And it's also been a very, and they sell military technology also to Israel. And to also go back to what you were saying, they were deactivating their air defense infrastructure so Israel could hit Lebanese, Hezbollah, and Iranian troops on the ground in Syria, right? They did not see their interests as fully aligned with the wide set of divergent interests that were in the axis. They did not. And this needs to be kind of accepted and understood at the same time as we understand that actually they're burning up US munitions in the Ukraine theater, and people are dying in an actual process of burning up the US military infrastructure that is used to oppress humanity. Like this is the landscape as I see it. It's full of contradictions, which is the contradictions of these forces that are still trying to have an inclusion in a US overseeing global capitalism that is actually only wanting to dominate the world by force, right? And they don't see it that way. Not all of them see it that way. And so it's going to require, we just have to try and ourselves see it that way and spread our way of seeing it. And hopefully more and more people will see it that way.
Well, Max, thank you so much for coming on and giving as much information. And also, like, I want to recommend that folks check out your other works because you have a long list of scholarship. I know right now you've been working with the People's Academy. I've been checking out that series. It's been great. Really great concepts, especially what you talked about now to kind of help dialectically understand what's happening, which I think is really important. But yeah, thank you so much, Max, for coming and allowing the audience to get a context on Syria that they are most likely not getting.
No, thank you so much. And if I just conclude with some sources so that people can build up their own education, which is that like Ali Qadri, his work on Syria, and Linda Matar's work on Syria, Patrick Higgins' work on Syria, and then Al Akhbar, which is Alakhbar, is now publishing regularly in English, and deserves the widest audience because then we get a direct perspective from anti-imperialist intellectuals, writers, journalists in primarily from Lebanon, but also a lot of Palestinians, Syrians, and so forth, and others. And this is how we avoid confusion, is by having those reference points in the primary arena of confrontation that are able to really provide necessary clarity.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Max. We appreciate you joining us.